likely to lead to a reduction in the enjoyment of basic human rights by the citizens of the country or countries undertaking the intervention, caused by, for example, increased poverty. Furthermore, given that a contracted combatant force need not consist entirely or even mostly of citizens of the country or countries funding the intervention, it is also likely to result in proportionally fewer citizen deaths among those engaged in the intervention than would be the case with an equivalent state military force. So, consequentialist considerations, that's what I focused on so far. And though they are key features of a legitimate intervener, a pure consequentialist approach obviously might have some dangers of leading to unhappy excesses. And for this reason, Patterson adds 3 non-consequentialist criteria of legitimacy, namely adherence to jus in bello norms, internal representativeness, and external local representativeness. And I go on to consider how our hypothetical contracted combatant force would fare when considered against these measures. So first, contracted combatants and jus in bello. One of Patterson's main concerns about the employment of contracted combatants is that the lack of appropriate mechanisms, legal and otherwise, by which to control such forces, which could make a contracted combatant force more likely to violate what Patterson calls external jus in bello norms, which are the traditional norms guiding the intervener's treatment of civilians and enemy combatants. But even if we grant that Patterson's concerns are currently justified, perhaps it is true that the mechanisms are not in place now, I see no reason why such controls could not be put in place. And so there is no reason why a future contracted combatant force must necessarily pose this kind of risk. Patterson also singles out what he calls internal principles of jus in bello, namely the requirements that the intervener employ only appropriate combatants in undertaking the intervention, and that the intervener fulfill a duty of care towards the combatants deployed on humanitarian interventions. Patterson is certainly right to be concerned that states may fail to fulfill the duty of care in the case of contracted combatants. But again, this is not an intrinsic feature of the employment of contracted combatants, and we might hope that greater awareness will lead to this becoming less of a problem in the future. But it is the requirement of employing only appropriate combatants for humanitarian interventions that I think is of most interest here. By singling out child soldiers and conscripts as inappropriate for such missions, Patterson raises the key issue of consent. With respect to members of the all-volunteer force, I think a question arises as to whether their obligation to risk death and injury continues to hold in cases where the defense of the state or its vital interests is not at stake, as we might think is often the case in humanitarian interventions. And the core moral challenge here, I think, is well articulated by my colleague Michael Gross, who writes this: if humanitarian intervention imposes a duty on democratic states, then someone, namely the soldiers of the state that intervenes, must bear the cost of protecting other human beings from genocide, enslavement, ethnic cleansing, and wanton rape and murder. These costs are not trivial, because some soldiers will die. But unless we are prepared to assume them, humanitarian intervention will fail. Here we face what John Lango has called the moral paradox of humanitarian intervention. Even if it is obligatory for a state collectively to intervene, it can still be supererogatory individually for its citizens. Low costs, great benefits, and the prospect of relatively few casualties obligate the state to intercede. High costs and the prospect of death, on the other hand, releases each citizen from the very same duty. Well, if this paradox holds, if Michael Gross is correct that in the absence of vital military, national, or strategic interests, no state may risk the lives of its soldiers, the same certainly cannot be said to be true of contracted combatants. Private warriors sign on for specific missions, and so there can be no question regarding their consent to the specifics of the mission concerned, whether it be humanitarian intervention or otherwise. It seems, therefore, again, if this paradox holds, that the employment of contracted combatants for humanitarian interventions provides a means whereby states could fulfill obligations to intervene without thereby violating their moral obligations to their own military personnel. But what if, as Patterson contends, military personnel do in fact recognize and accept that the terms of their service may require them to risk their lives in humanitarian interventions? In that case, we can view modern state combatants as in effect consenting to a general requirement that they serve in humanitarian interventions. But I think even if this is so, it seems that still we have a reason to prefer the employment of contracted combatants. For though the individual soldier, sailor, airman, or marine may be understood as consenting in general to undertake humanitarian interventions, the contracted combatant consents to risking his or her life and limb in support of a specific humanitarian intervention. So the consent, I think specific consent, needs to be weighed more heavily than general consent, and so that is a reason to favor the contracted combatant. I missed a slide. All right. Contracted combatants and internal representativeness. Internal representativeness is the term Patterson coins to address the question of the support for the intervention among the citizens of the country or countries undertaking the intervention. At some level, this is an issue independent of what type of force, whether contracted or state, is employed for the actual operation. But there is more to it than that. There is a strong case here for the idea that employing contracted combatants will make meeting the requirement of internal representativeness easier to achieve. If that is true, then this is clearly a morally significant advantage that a contracted combatant force has over its state equivalent. For the easier it is to meet the conditions for legitimate intervention without weakening those conditions, the greater the likelihood is that there will be potential interveners who could legitimately undertake the intervention. And here I have a small disagreement with I don't know if it was your position, but the position you mentioned yesterday, George, about the threshold problem. It's my view that if we can lower the threshold for intervention, that's a good thing. If we have a just cause, then there's a good reason to intervene. And I think that the fact that sometimes consequentialist considerations hold us back from intervening should be a cause of sadness, not a cause for rejoicing. So consider the issue of political will. Political will is, of course, a fickle thing. While the cost of a deployment, the monetary cost of a deployment might be an issue that threatens to undermine the political will, it is generally the more emotive issue of the cost in human lives among the nation's military forces that most quickly erodes political will. The material resources demanded of citizens through taxation to enable a humanitarian intervention are, of course, if the argument for cost savings through contracting holds, comparatively lower when contracted combatants are used for the mission. And just a small reference here, but a study not that long ago by the United States Congressional Budget Office, which considered the cost of replacing the contractors supporting U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan with military units, concluded this: over the long term, using military units would cost 90% more than using contractors and would have high upfront costs associated with equipping the new units. So to whatever degree the financial cost is reduced, then the challenge of securing internal representativeness for an intervention undertaken in this way is thereby decreased. Even more significant is the impact when human resources are considered. For better or for worse, the cost in terms of battlefield casualties weighs considerably less on contemporary societies when those casualties are contracted combatants than when they are soldiers, sailors, marines, or airmen of the nation's military services. This holds to an even greater degree when the contracted combatants are citizens of nations other than the ones undertaking the intervention. Of course, at first glance, this social reality seems to be a form of callous chauvinism. Drawing this conclusion would, I think, though, be too quick. For there is another important consideration here, namely the third factor that accounts for the importance of internal representativeness, individual self-governance. When a government, say that of Britain, sends troops from its military services to undertake a humanitarian intervention, there is an important and non-trivial sense in which these troops represent the people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. For Britons, these are our troops, they represent us. That identification is, of course, considerably loosened or even broken when those sent into the fray wear a different uniform or no uniform at all. And there is ample evidence of this from recent experience. Again, sticking with the British example, the British government has in recent times faced a considerable challenge in convincing the British people to continue to support the deployment of British troops in Afghanistan. By contrast, the British government faces no such problems when it comes to arguments about what funds they should contribute to sending UN peacekeepers from developing world nations into zones of conflict. Of course, these UN peacekeepers are ours for the people of some nation, so the problem is not entirely avoided. But what if UN member states funded a Security Council-approved humanitarian intervention that was conducted by one or more multinational private military companies? Again, it seems that in such a case, the threshold for meeting the criterion of internal representativeness would be slightly or significantly lower, which represents a significant advantage where a contracted combatant force rather than a state military force is employed. I didn't get ahead of myself. So that's where I am. I apologize. Contracted combatants and local external representativeness. Finally, following Patterson's moderate instrumental approach, there is the requirement of local external representativeness, which is this. What impact is employing a contracted combatant force likely to have on the acceptance of the intervention by those who the intervention is designed to help, as well as affected bystanders? And the answer will, of course, depend heavily on the specific circumstances of the intervention. If the intervention takes place in a country where a previous generation of contracted combatants has committed atrocities, then the likelihood is strong that a contracted combatant force will not be welcomed. It depends also on who is behind the contracted combatant force. If, say, the United States is the employer of the force and the US is very unpopular in that particular region, then it may make very little difference that the troops on the ground are not uniformed US military personnel. Though it is at least possible that judicious selection of personnel with appropriate cultural knowledge and backgrounds could ameliorate local hostility to some degree. On the other hand, there is also a case to be made that a contracted combatant force employed under a UN mandate and backed by a broad multinational coalition could be seen by local actors as apolitical, thereby reducing the potential for tensions between locals and the intervening force. It is also important to note that in circumstances severe enough to warrant a humanitarian intervention, such as genocide or ethnic cleansing, any effective intervener is likely to be welcomed by the affected community, regardless of their current country of origin or contractual status. And certainly the anecdotal evidence suggests that those citizens of Sierra Leone who were rescued by executive outcomes from the horrific slaughter and mutilations carried out by the RUF weren't particularly bothered by the fact that the EO personnel, these good-looking gentlemen behind me, they welcomed as liberators were contracted combatants. So they may not look like much to us, but I think to the people of Sierra Leone, they look like knights in shining armor. So my conclusion. Patterson wisely warns us not to attempt to determine legitimacy in the case of humanitarian intervention as some fixed variable. The legitimacy of an intervener will almost always depend on the circumstances of the particular intervention being proposed. That will be as true for the intervener which offers a force of contracted combatants as its intervening force, as it is for interveners who propose to undertake the mission using state military forces. Nonetheless, it seems that when measured against Patterson's comprehensive framework of analysis for determining the legitimacy of potential humanitarian interveners, our hypothetical contracted combatant force not only does not comprehensively fail to meet the criterion of Patterson's moderate instrumentalist account, but in fact, in some respects, fares better than an equivalent force composed of state military personnel. Thank you.
Well, I failed rather miserably in my ethics of responsibility to crack the whip out of conviction and concern and interest in these fascinating presentations. I think we should go right to questions from the field, and there are many. Yes, Michael.
Alan, that was a fascinating speech and talk. It's always nice when someone tests your intuitions like that. I have a question, though, and actually a question for everyone on the panel. Don't the data you present also suggest grounds for preventive humanitarian intervention? And if so, what would that look like? What would you need, kind of evidence would you need to make that decision? And again, that's anyone on the panel as well.
Again, it depends how you define intervention. I apologize. I really had to skip over that slide. But I think when I think of intervention and when I've written about it, I don't consider it only military intervention. It can be from the mildest forms, which are hortatory or rhetorical condemnation, to mediation, to economic sanctions and incentives. Then we start to get into the harder ones, which can include arming rebels, no-fly zones, actual boots on the ground, peacekeeping, or enforcement. And so the question is, what do we mean by preventive intervention? And I personally think that my recommendations are about prevention. When I say that we should announce we are not going to come to the aid of provocative rebels so long as the government responds proportionately, and we announce that as a policy, I think that's preventive diplomacy, because we're going to prevent the rebellion and therefore prevent the retaliation that's going to kill civilians. When I say we should, rather than helping rebels, we should try and support peaceful protesters by using sticks and carrots towards governments so that they concede to the legitimate demands of peaceful protesters, I consider that to be preventive intervention. The question I think you were asking is, should we put boots on the ground preventively? And